We've been fighting a long time, and we have all lost so very much, so many loved ones gone. But you are not alone. There are pockets of resistance all around the planet. We are at the brink. You have no idea how important you are. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
Ave Maria Stella, Dei Mater Alma, ad semper Virgo, Felix te porta.
Welcome, everybody. Steve with Science of Fidelity. I'm coming at you with Jeb Smith, who you may have seen on a couple other podcasts, but I don't know. It's a topic that I think you guys are going to like. I halfway through this, I'm thinking he's a brother from another mother for me, because his thinking is pretty much on par with what I've had. Anyway, Jeb, welcome. How you doing? Glad to have you.
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me on.
So the book is Missing Monarchy. If your eyebrows aren't intrigued already, because how I found you, a friend of mine on a Signal group sent me, "Hey, Steve, you're going to like this." And it was an interview with Michael Hitchborn that you did.
Yep.
And I was like, all right, I'll check it out. Missing Monarchy. Okay, cool. I put it in the history thing. I listen to podcasts when I'm working out. So I got done with everything else, and I remember seeing, oh, yeah, I haven't hit this one yet. I might as well hit play. 3 minutes in, I'm going, what, man, don't judge a book by its cover. Literally. I mean, I had to rewind it a couple times, listen through it again, going, I was texting priests up afterwards, saying, you've got to read this book. And I was even contacting those Abby Boister going, have you heard of this guy? This is like the beginning. I looked at his book. I was like, you could retitle this The Beginning of Centralization. I think I wrote you that. Anyway, thank you for putting this together. And first, I guess the softball question to start. What made you think of writing a book on monarchy, and why was it intriguing for you?
Well, it definitely wasn't an aim of mine. I love J.R.R. Tolkien, and I wrote a book about J.R.R. Tolkien. And as I was studying Tolkien and what influenced his worldview and how he thought, I really dug into the Anglo-Saxon history. And I started making all these connections between Tolkien, Middle-earth, the free people in Anglo-Saxon England especially. And as I was discovering what life was like and what the political systems were like, I said, this is not what I'd been taught. There's nothing, as I understood it to be. The Middle Ages, I thought, were the Dark Ages. I thought kings were oppressive tyrants. And come to find out, they were actually very libertarian, in that Tolkien, who popularized anarcho-monarchism, was taking much from the Middle Ages in his form of kingship and putting it into the free people's realms. And so I expanded to all of Europe, and I just kept finding more and more information that really stunned me, and that was opposed to what I thought the Middle Ages were like, and I wanted to share that information. When I'm taught one way and I discover that it's false, that intrigues me alone, and it makes me want to dig in deeper. And then I want to share what I find with other people who could be interested in it. And so that's really what kind of ignited it all. And I was fortunate to have a huge amount of time, a lot of resources and research went into it, a lot of thinking, and I enjoyed it all. And as you said, that 14th century, a lot of things converge on that. It's not just political. Society really changed then. And to me, if someone could take something from my book, I would love for them to view the Middle Ages, that 14th century, as the end of it, because I think that's kind of the beginning of the end, the beginning of modern society, where we separate from Christendom and move towards secularization, centralization, authoritarianism, and the whole world changes in that century. To me, it's the most important century besides the AD BC split.
He brought up, or ladies and gentlemen, he brings up the stuff about what we were not taught in school. There will be a part 2 to this, because he wrote a book that's really near and dear to my heart, Defending Dixie. We will be doing something.
And then that was the first one for sure. That was eye-opening to me in so many ways. Like, how could the education system in America be so off and be so manipulative over our own history that occurred just 150 years ago? and that they do the same thing in the Middle Ages. I kind of chose, in a way, you said the softball question, I kind of chose softball areas of history that's very easy to show what people are taught is not true. It'd probably be more difficult in other areas, but the Civil War in the Middle Ages, to me, were the ones that it's kind of very easy to overturn falsehoods because it's so evidently false what we're taught today, I guess.
Speaking of what we're taught, all right, monarchy versus a king. What is the difference? Because I guess most of us would think the same. We're looking at that meme. It's the same picture.
Right.
You bring up this totally different thing. It's not the same.
Right. And you know, the title of my book is Missing Monarchy, so that puts in the mind people's perception of a monarch. But I felt like I had to do that because the general audience who would look at the cover, consider reading the book, knows what a monarch is and doesn't know the difference between a king and a monarch, which is also why that's the first subject I really dig into. And so from around this generalization, from around 700 to 1300, you have kings and their kins. They're members of their kingship. Like Deuteronomy 17 says, a king is not above his people. He's a member of the community. Mm-hmm. He's also limited by law. So the king does not have legislation ability. He can't create law or manipulate law as a monarch can. When secular Roman law returns in the 14th century, we start returning to what the emperors were and kind of more the pagan dictators. So that's when kings morph into monarchs. They become more powerful. Power becomes centralized. They own a geographic area. They're ahead. They're above all the people. Whereas a king, he's simply limited by the customs and laws. He's serving the people. And the laws and customs of those people came centuries before, and they're ingrained like the 10 Commandments, and they don't change. And they're considered to have derived from either biblical law or God's kind of law into nature and into the people. And so it's really Christ as king under kingship. And so under a monarch, a human is the ruler, and he has authority and he has power. Under kingship, the king is simply serving the people and serving God, and he's under their limitations and customs, and he can't go beyond those. And as soon as he does, he's no longer a king. So there's no blind obedience in kingship. The king's performing a duty, and your fealty is to him following the law. As soon as he goes outside the law, which is considered derived from God, he's now a tyrant. He's at war with God. He's trying to elevate human in his own opinions or desires above what God declares. And so the people are supposed to rightfully rebel against him. Whereas monarch, we usually think of, which was of Protestant origins, the divine right of kings, that God instituted these human rulers to rule us. But that's not the case. You look at the Bible, when the Hebrew kings followed God, they were following his law. And that's what was considered following God, is following his law. You don't go beyond that and do your own thing, or you're now stepped outside of his bounds. So the king, he can't do anything that's not, he can't legislate, he can't increase his power in any way. He's simply serving in his limit. He's severely limited in what he can do. He's below the people, really, not above them as a monarch is.
Different from like many people probably think of King George ruling over this great land.
Right.
I guess that was the biggest thing when I was reading. Like, okay, because you think of ancient Greece. I was telling my wife this the other day. You didn't have Greece going to war with them. You had the Athenians, you had the Spartans, you had this group over here. You had many different little groups. And Germany had, I think Thomas Wood said, like 200 sub-states.
Right. Yeah, 250, I think.
Yeah, and even after World War I, there was 21 before Adolf decided to unify everything. So instead of one person over this gigantic land, because I would start wondering, how many people did these guys have under them? Because in my mind, I'm thinking the king of France was the entire realm of France, or king of Spain, the entire realm of France. But it was much, 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 much less decentralized.
And that's where, it's also based on personal relationships, feudalism. So the king's interacting with only his vassals. That's really all he has control over, is his direct vassals. And they only have control over their direct vassals. And it's all this personal relationship. It's not this way a modern state or a king is the ruler of the whole realm. It's very tribal. And that's where, like you were mentioning, the different Germans, every tribe kind of had their own king or their own lord with their own tribes, and they were loosely federated, perhaps, or connected in some form or another, but it wasn't like this tribe and this tribe impacted each other, had any effect, or the lord over here. It was only the lord of this tribe who maybe interacted with a vassal above him who interacted with the king. So it's a whole different system. It's very hard to imagine today how localized it was, and that the thought of, might makes right, or because there's 10 people over here and 9 over here, that justifies them ruling and picking the rulers over the 9. That's not their thought, because it's a very Christian society. And the Middle Ages especially put a lot of emphasis on free will. You can choose Christ, you can reject him, you can join the church, you can dismiss it. That is your choice. You have the right to do it. And they applied the same thing to politics. They didn't have the blind obedience that we do today. They said, you should choose your own customs, your own people, how to live by, and then you guys live by those over here, and we're going to live this way over here. And that's one thing I definitely enjoy about the systems.
Yeah, because you bring that up, and I think it's the epilogue. Actually, a priest friend wrote me the other day saying, "You know what, Steve? You know what we need to do is get together with 50 different people and come with our own little currency, and we just trade barter between each other." And I'm going, "Yes, there we go." And you bring that up, wondering because people probably think it's they've heard me say this. The Yankee mindset of, I want you to live like I want you to. Right. Everyone live exactly like me. And if you don't like it, I'm going to force it on you somehow, versus a liberty to do it, not making liberty a God. But if you want to live like an idiot over here, go do it.
Yeah.
We're going to live.
You're going to suffer your consequences, but you're allowed to do that.
Right. Yeah. Just don't cross this line right here.
Right. Yeah.
You do you. We'll do us over here. Right. We'll teach each other. If you don't like it, you can ask us and we'll explain why you're wrong, and you can convert if you want. But It's not a sword going. It's not the bayonet constitution idea.
Right. When I talk to people today about decentralization, they assume, you can't interact with them. It's like, what do you mean? Like, think about Vermont and New Hampshire. We interact all the time. We travel, we visit, all that. But we do have, to some extent, different laws, not like in the Middle Ages. But you can live separately, have your own ways, and still have peace. And actually, it'll get rid of a lot of the antagonism that democracy creates, because we don't have to fight over it. Everyone has already achieved that self-government. You don't have to keep electing the right people and donating and everything like that. It's a live and let live attitude. And I think I mentioned that to bring up Dixie, that the North, they did not have that. They wanted to conquer everyone because they were the best in their mind, and everyone should live as they live. They're kind of that God-ordained way to live. And the South knew it. The South had the live and let live attitude, and they warned the Native Americans about it. And the other minorities, they say, look, they're not going to stop with the South. They're going to wipe out. They're going to put you on plantations. They're going to control you. They're going to force their ways on you. And they're going to go to the West, and then they're going to go international, which is what America has done, because it's that mindset of,
you got you start from small, it gets bigger and bigger. Now we got the North American Union idea coming through. And the professor from Florida Atlantic wrote the book on the DeRosa.
Yeah, DeRosa. Yep.
He mentioned in a lecture, he goes, "What's after the centralization of what nationalism that we have right now? Globalism." And we're going like, "Yep, you're seeing this come in."
The one world government idea.
Yeah. And I guess that's another thing, because everyone goes into nationalism, not bad. I go, guys, this is 19th century nationalism, when everything was just the states be damned, in a sense. We're going to turn, and that's not just here, Italy, Germany, France with the French Revolution. Everything just got put into one gigantic entity. And that's where you get all these massive wars. I mean, in the 14th, you didn't have these.
Right. And so many of the dictatorships that arose, as I talk about in the book, came once you entered the politics and centralization. You have all these different political groups or military groups and leaders now fighting pretty much a civil war, and whoever comes out on top, suppresses everyone else. And that's how you end up with all the dictators. And that's why I'd say even monarchy or kingship is a great protective from dictators, whereas democracy creates that the avenue and the tension for people to get so sick of each other. Think of how much people hate Trump. I live here in Vermont, it's the most liberal state in the union, and people despise him. A lot of people despise him. And same with a lot of Trump supporters. They despise Harris. It creates that anger because we're forcing our ways. We're not living and let live. We're forcing our ways on others, and we're combating right now through voting, but it breaks out in civil war because that's human nature. in so many different places leads to the death and destruction you're talking about. Centralization, it is good for corporations and business, and I think it honestly is better for economics, but it's not better for people, in my opinion. Freedom, self-government, family, it's hinders much more than it helps.
Right, right. And then you get the fallen nature of man come in. I mean, if you're a big corporation idea, I remember doing this when I was in medical sales. We had a company that was going out of business, and my direct boss calls me up and say, we got to get their accounts. I'm like, dude, they just lost their jobs. Can we let them? We not stab them right now and help them out in a way, but in a localized area, everybody, you're helping each other out, you're supporting each other's business. Remember, like in the Native Americans, there was no sense of idea of somebody stealing because they knew each other. They would take if they had a table, they would take what they need and left whatever the price was. And can you imagine that here? You can't go anywhere, and you lock your doors, and you're afraid of your neighbors. You don't trust your neighbors anymore. You don't even know your neighbors anymore.
Yeah, that local community has been completely torn apart, and I think that's purposely, and it makes people dependent on something outside of their family, which ends up being the state, which I think was the whole purpose. Or the corporation, the business, or the state, one or the other, or both.
And you mentioned this about the authority of the king, that guys would actually come up to him, and if he was overstepping his boundaries, they'd probably get him in line or remove him in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and there was many ways to do it. The most common would be simply to ignore him, and they did that. And it was the inefficiency of the time and the period, especially with travel. If a vassal ignores a king, nothing could happen maybe for 5 years, and then the king will maybe threaten him or something, and there could be a dispute among the vassals and lords. But you could take a lord out, obviously, as I said, in an assassination type situation, which happened. Often on hunting trips. If you read the histories of kings, a lot of them disappeared on hunting trips. And
is that Jamie over there?
Lords, you could challenge to duels, but that's the thing. It was part of the law for the vassal to rebel. So he was being lawful, and the other vassals would unite as well. Because if a king's trying to intrude on one vassal's rights or becoming tyrannical, say his other 9 major lords are looking at this saying, hey, this king he'll do it to us if he'll do it to our fellow vassal, we must uphold the law. We're going to unite against this king and overthrow him. And so occasions like that did happen, but usually, the disputes did not last long. It came to diplomatic terms, or someone was declared, acting illegally, and then he lost his following, and the church or the Pope would step in and side with one, and one would gain authority, and it would end pretty quickly.
Well, they run out of money to fight. They couldn't do it anymore.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing. That's another benefit of not having centralization and taxation. The feudal king, did not have the professional year-round financial taxes supporting him or his military, his own money from his own lands, and it was all built on loyalty. So he had to be acting correct within his law and his jurisdiction, or his vassals and the people he depends on for his muster and his men are not going to support him in something that if he's acting tyrannically. So it provided multiple incentives to keep a king in check. Not that it already worked, but it's much better than what we have today, which is no check at all, especially since the Civil War. The states are powerless to object. And so we just end up in one progressive direction.
And 40% of your income just goes up automatically to your lords. Yeah. And we say we're more free.
And you mentioned King George is an absolute monarch. He put on 3% tea tax, and that caused a rebellion. And think of the taxation we face today. And it's so hidden out. We have so many taxes that we don't realize actually. I'm sure someone has calculated out depending on the state and where you are. But if you put in all the different state, local, federal taxes, including DMV, registering your vehicle, all these permissions that you need, it's just insane. Yeah.
But how's the T-tax? How's that cause a revolution? But what are we?
And that's the obedience and the democratic mindset, as I talk about, and why that's instilled into people so that we end up just these hardworking slaves that spend our whole life earning money for the capitalists and then paying taxes for the government. But our whole families are falling apart, our society, our community, because we're we're too busy to do anything about it. And we're powerless. I don't know what you do. The government has all the guns. They had the monopoly on violence, as they say. You have no resistance. Whereas in the Middle Ages, you had lords and vassals who were often more powerful than the king. And so it was very easy to resist a wayward tyrant in the Middle Ages.
You mentioned culture and the church a minute ago. The church was big in the feudal times, and the culture was very different.
Right. Yeah.
How's the church in this system? How did they? I mean, obviously we know that they were above everything. It was church, and now it's kind of inverted.
Right.
They telling the church, lockdowns and stuff like that came down. But we actually cared about what the local bishop said, and people actually. And back then, I remember one guy made a post about like Italy, the diocese in Italy, and it was very. You read about Alphonsus; he was able to go to all those churches on a donkey. It's very hard to travel with a car or anything like that. So everything was, even the church in the diocese was more localized. Yeah,
even the church was localized, decentralized, as I talk about. It was more, and the Pope himself was more of a king rather than what he's become, I believe, in a monarch. And it was more decentralized. And like you said, your local priest or your local bishop has the most authority on you back in the Middle Ages, because that's pretty much all you know. Pope made travel through town, and it's this huge, big celebration, like you said, with the Native Americans before they get the letter. I'm sure the same thing occurred in the Middle Ages. If someone, a lord or a bishop, were to receive a letter from a pope, it'd be a huge deal alone. But as far as the church, I mean, it's just what you said. The church is above everything else. It's number one in life. Christ is king was a common saying, not just politically, but in your heart, in your home. Everything was structured to replicate Catholicism and God's instructions and laws and what they believed they were supposed to do. As I talk about, there wasn't really a whole lot of doubt in their mind, and it was more of a practical religion. So it was played out in society. They had no idea separation church and state is really what it is. That in the modern mind, we compartmentalize our religion from our politics, from our health. We're kind of taught that in government schools as we go from one class to the next. But back then, just as Thomas Aquinas said, we're a united whole in politics. You are in your mind and your soul. And if God's the most important thing, he's the most important thing in how you structure your family, how you do education, how you do politics, how you do music, art. And so everything is, just permeated with God in one way or the other, because he's always the highest priority and he's above all else. So everything else is supposed to conform to that.
What you were saying reminded me of a 10th Amendment Center had a video on oaths and how that modern politicians violate it all the time. Mm-hmm. And then they bring up that the history of it was, because it got brought up again because they said Trump didn't touch the Bible. Like, hey, you didn't have to put his hand on it. He just had to say the oath, which no one keeps by anyways. And even the founders were going, we don't want any atheists to do it, because if you say an oath and you don't believe,
right,
then why are you saying an oath? But if you actually believe and you're saying an oath, that's going to hold you to a different mindset than you would before. Now, today, as we go from centralization to I am that God, we just don't. We're just going to say you're going to do the oath, go through the little words, and we're going to rule like I want to rule.
Right. Yeah. And I think I mentioned that in one of my books, how when I went for a speeding ticket, and in Vermont, they got rid of the under God. And I said, how pointless is it? Why would, if I was an atheist and I didn't believe in God and I wasn't swearing before God, why would I self-incriminate myself, which is basically what the court system is now asking you to do, because they want you to swear an oath to them rather than God. They want to be that highest authority. But it's going to completely change your mind. Your obligation is always first and foremost to whatever's highest in your mind, whatever you think is most important. If you're a Christian, that's going to be God. And if you're secularist, it's going to probably be the state. And that's what they seek to do. And it'll change everything about what you do in life, all the decisions you make and how you act, how you vote, and so on.
Well, people get arrested for having raw milk, or the land of the free. If you don't, we're probably violating 5 laws right now. But it's the old joke. If anybody doesn't know what we're talking about, there's an old joke. Yeah. You're doing something illegal. every moment of the day with stacks of laws this big,
Right.
which they didn't have back then, obviously.
And I think, yeah, I think I mentioned that's the thing about having a professional state that you're paying money to pass laws. That's what they're doing. They're in DC. They're living there. It's their job to pass laws. They're going to consistently regulate you and pass laws because it's in their mindset. And I was having a discussion on Dixie in a recent podcast, and how representatives and senators used to be of the state. So they were in their state, and then they get called to DC. That's a completely different mindset because you're a local representative, which you're supposed to be, going to DC to advocate for your local people. Now they're just another member of the national political party with an R or D next to them, and they're just voting in line with the systems that be. And so that gives a completely different mindset as well, that they forget the local people. That's just the avenue of how they get to power in DC. And then they're a party member. They're no longer a local representative.
Yeah, because if they were the state, if they did something against the state would call them back. You're not doing your job. You're out of here. You're
Right,
fired.
yeah.
Now you got guys from California influencing votes in Virginia.
Yeah, we have Bernie Sanders here in Vermont, and he was from New York, tried to get elected a bunch of places, couldn't do it, went and sought out a real liberal area in Burlington, Vermont, and got politically started there just so he could end up, getting federally where he wanted to be. If he couldn't do it where he was, he'll go somewhere else and do it.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Roman part of it, from going from this type of mindset to a Romanistic mindset. Can you explain to them what you mean by that, from kind of like an empire type mindset?
Yeah, well, a lot of the old emperors and pagan dictators were divine in themselves, and so, or they were considered descendants from a god or to be worshipped as God. Caesar was worshipped as a god on earth, and so if your ruler is divine, then he kind of can do what he wants. You have this sort of blind obedience towards him, that anything he declares as law. Just like in America, we've transferred that blind obedience to the state, and now the federal government decides. So whatever they say is legal, we all blindly follow because we have to, we're forced to. They are the ultimate authority. If the Supreme Court decides something, that the Second Amendment means something it didn't mean for 150 years, we all blindly go along with it because they have that authority, and they're rulers over a geographic area. And back in the Middle Ages, it was up to each individual, each vassal, and even, as I said, individual peasant, to determine if his lord was overstepping his laws and customs, because he was the ruler. The government, Thomas Aquinas again said, the prince is made for the people aren't made for the prince. You have your laws, your customs, and they are your servant, and you judge if they're doing it correctly. If they're not doing it correctly, they're no longer doing their service. They're not your prince anymore. And so it's not blind obedience, it's consent. And the authority is no longer up top. It's from the bottom, from the people up, even though it's derived from God, actually, at the top of the hierarchy. No man is above another. We're all created equal in a way. As much as feudalism is about a hierarchy, it's really also about equality in a way that we don't have today, that we've instituted a hierarchy for our politicians today that get to enjoy benefits and are treated differently, and we're kind of the peasants below them. Back then, the peasants had a lot of say in judging the rulers above them.
I guess
so bottom up rather than top down.
Yeah, you bring up, there's an example of that current situation is, say, like a president driving down in your town, the entire road is closed down. It's it's like that. Well, I mean, Mason and Henry and all those guys said you can have an elected monarch. Why don't just go ahead and do it now and get it out of the way? Let's transfer them into it, which we have now, and people can deny it. But when you got someone signing with a pen, is, don't worry, Obama did it too, Clinton did it, Bush started, Bush did it, all these guys did it.
And as long as the federal government says it's okay, that's what law is. And we're supposed to just be like, okay, well, we get screwed here again as well, because we have no way to, because of that blind obedience that's instituted and enforced, really.
What were some of the levels during this time in the feudal communities? There was different sections of people. What were they, and how did they relate to each other?
Yeah, well, most historians would divide the society as a whole into three: those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. So you had the church, which is the bishops, the priests, but also the monks. Monks are huge at this time, and they're doing a lot of scholarly work, and they're also doing a lot of prayer. And people really, they're in a way, they're kind of like the rock stars of their day. A lot of people would go vacation, do pilgrimages to different monasteries, and they looked at them as great examples of Christian brotherhood and intelligence. They're kind of the technologically advanced at the time because a lot of the greatest minds are there. And then you have the working class, which is a mix of peasants and serfs, and they're, of course, doing a lot of the manual labor and the agricultural work, producing food, so that people like the monks can do what they do. Monks, a lot of them put full time into scholarship, into reading, into learning, to copying manuscripts, which took a huge amount of time. And so that society at the time thought it's important enough that we need to provide for them to do their service, because their prayers alone are worth us providing for them, because they're giving us that service back spiritually and intellectually. And then you have the lords, who in the knights, who are the military, who obviously everyone wants a military to protect himself. So you have the local knight or a lord of a manor, and he has everything provided for him by the peasants and the serfs on his manor and in his location, so that he can now train for war full time and do some of his other duties that he's supposed to do and protect the people. And so it was protection, it was God, and then the peasants serving. But at the same time, there's equality, as I said, within this hierarchy. Today, we're taught to really be jealous, I guess I'd say, of other people. And back then, I quote one historian who said the shoemaker, in his mind, he's the prince of the shoemakers, and that's his job, and he loves it, and he takes pride in it, and he passes on to his kids who want to do it as well. And they take pride in that, and they don't seek to be the knight, or they don't seek to be a monk. I mean, some of them do. But as a general rule, everyone they don't feel below or above on a hierarchy, and they're perfectly okay. They're content with where they are.
It's not in this book, but in the other book you mentioned, and kind of what that mindset is. They didn't live in fear of being fired, getting food on the table, in a sense. I mean, they had to provide it. Whereas today, people go to work in fear, underneath, the dictatorship of their boss.
Yeah.
Spending, working as much as they can to probably make ends meet, barely make any. As you mentioned, leisure, you get off at maybe 9 to 5, you're spending an hour or two on the road both ways, and get back to take your kid to soccer or baseball practice. Yeah. And then maybe you're eating fast food to get to it because you don't have any time. And by the time everything's done, it's 9 o'clock. You need to get to bed so you can repeat all that office space in the morning, basically.
Yeah.
Very different mindset in life in general. I mean, looking at almost like you live in free in a sense. You want to be a shoemaker? Be a shoemaker. You work as much as you want. Takes time off. You get the job done. People still love you. You're getting your mind's on the church. Your mind's on praying. You're doing other things. It's not 24/7. I got my slave device in my hand. Make sure my boss doesn't email me, and I got to get up and do something.
Right. Yeah. And you're with your family. You're doing festivals. That's one of the things. Like, people assume the peasant, because there was very real starvation, that the peasant must have been working nonstop to barely survive. And if you weren't working hard enough, then you must have starved to death. But as I talked about, is generally you could have 19 years of abundance, and a plague comes through and wipes out the cattle in the area. They don't have the refrigeration. They don't have the long distance trade. So if your local area gets wiped out, you're in a lot of trouble. And that's how, people can starve. But it doesn't mean you're working to barely provide for yourself. They actually worked far less hours, as I said in my book, than we do today. And it was at a far more leisurely rate. And one thing I love about the manor system, so there's even the serfs, the lowest of the low, that had the most obligations. Their work in the field was divided for what was expected for a day's work. And so the boss, the Lord, wasn't over them, watching them as we have today, making sure they're being productive. they were out on their own. They could decide to go through it really fast to get it done, or go through it leisurely and take longer, or have their brother do it, have their son do it, pay someone else to do it. There was a huge amount of freedom in that. And the work was just far more leisurely. They didn't have all of the distractions and chores that we do today that take away from life. And part of that is just a local village. Like one show I love, Little House on the Prairie. I'm sure you've seen it, but you see that sort of life. They don't have a lot of distractions. It's basically family, the church, and doing things like that. And it's just, you can up and leave work at any time you want. If some event happens, or there's a festival, there's a 2-week festival, everyone takes it off and they celebrate because they can do that. You can't do that here. It's very difficult. You have your select vacation time, but it's, not nearly as much as what they had. And you're more your own boss to such an extent that is unimaginable to so many people today living under the capitalist system, I would say.
Yes. There's so many. I'm trying not to take any detours. Easy to do. So, what you mentioned about it was kind of funny part of it. You're for dictatorship at the house. I'm going to teach my kids this. I'm going to teach them this. They're going to
teach this. Right. And so you're talking about the education section?
Yes.
Yeah. And that's why, like, I go through all this complaining, I guess you'd say, or pointing out secular education in mind control. But really, there's no way not to do that. And we homeschooled our children, and that's mind control in a way. I mean, we have them watch a lot of debates and everything, but they were consistently reinforced a certain worldview and perspective that I wanted them to have, and have that instilled on the kids, which is the Bible mandates parents to do for their children. And so really, to me, there's no such thing as unbiased. It's just about what bias is being pushed.
1,000%.
Yeah. And so, I act as if you allowed me to be a dictator, I would become a supreme. I would think it's all good, of course. As I said, everyone would be reading J.R. Tolkien. I'd be a tyrant for sure, which is why you don't want to give me that power. I was debating one person on a forum about monarchy, democracy, and they're like, "Oh yeah, you like monarchy because you assume you'd be a king or something back then." I said, "No, I'd much rather be a peasant and be away from all of that stuff. And you wouldn't want me to be a king, because I probably would be one of the ones that would try to step over, and people would have to put me back in line, which is why you don't want me in power, or people like me." And it's one thing I despise about democracy, because those people are guaranteed to get in. It's only people who want power. Most people that have that, as a medieval or Southern attitude of live and let live, they're not going to go into politics because they don't want to get involved with it. They don't want to boss other people around. They don't want to get into all the bickering. The people that do are the ones that want power in the first place. And we campaign and we elect them, the people that fight hardest to gain that power. It's the complete opposite. As Thomas Aquinas, to quote again, said, the last person you want in power is someone who seeks it. And that was a huge medieval idea, both with it never, of course, was accomplished 100%, but the ideal is someone who doesn't want power, who's a servant, who's a member of his community serving them, not someone who desires it, which is why I love hereditary inheritance, because it eliminates the possibility of all those people who want to control you and want power, which are the worst ones. They can't get it anymore. It's now in a bloodline. It's now passed down from father to son, which is why the people celebrated heirs and having a strong bloodline with a lot of, healthy line to continue that without the fighting that would arise, or people trying to gain the crown if there's not a straight, obvious line. It's part of why the Kingdom of Jerusalem went down, is because they really failed to have productive heirs, whoever's in power. And so that transfer of power usually always brings some sort of struggle and debate about where the line should go. And so no one liked that. And so the people want a king with a lot of descendants to ensure that will follow this bloodline. You don't have all those other people who want power to get it.
And if you get somebody that's taught well, like King St. Louis, You get a King St. Louis, you get a King St. Stephen. If you get somebody in that line, they're taught well, they're raised well.
Right.
And then obviously the opposite side, because I think Aquinas brings up, because what's the worst, the best, and it is at the worst, because you get
Right.
you get somebody that's tyrannical, because just like a dog, you raise it the wrong way, you're going to get a bad dog out of it.
Right. And that's a good thing to me about kingship rather than monarchies. It doesn't really, it does matter, but not much to what king coming in. So you could have a really defect or weak king, but he can't really do the harm that a weak monarch could do, because he doesn't have the power and ability. He simply has to serve his duty. Though people definitely, lords and vassals, took advantage of a weak-minded king, usually to gain their own independence and autonomy, separate from the crown. And so that's obviously, you know, a negative. But
it's interesting you brought up that stay away from the guys that want power, because we think about it as Catholics. If you hear about somebody saying, "Oh, he's wanting to be a bishop," everyone, their brother goes automatically. That should be the one where you hear, "Oh, he should. I want to be an exorcist," and all they're saying, "No, that's the guy you don't want."
right,
But in politics, no one thinks that. We're behind the guy that wants to do it. Or you don't hear of the office of the Cincinnatus, where the guy was a peasant, and they say, "All right, you're gonna take power when he's done, he gave the power back."
Yeah.
I mean, Washington apparently he didn't want it, but they made him.
Right. Yeah. And that's great. We used to have more of those servants, public servants, I guess. That was the ideal and the intention, not campaigning politicians. And I'd also say politicians, I had that section how they're very similar to psychopaths in their mentality. And I think a good number of them are. But they're good at manipulating and to act like they're only here to help the people, and they want to serve them, and that's why they're going to power, when really it's because they want the power in the first place. So, I mean, I think voters are very easily deceived into believing their guy is good. The other guy, yeah, he's a politician. It's so obvious. How can people support him? But my guy, he's good,
I never got a T-shirt from winning an election. I never got a W thing or trophy, but it is something. I think Franklin brought up Mike Church's documentary on the Road to 76 talks about it. He brings up so power and greed separate is not something that's going to be terrible in this position, but when they're brought together, you're going to have tyrants that are going to come in. They will be your rulers. You're going to have the unvirtuous, I think is what he said. So if I guess give me a politician that says they're going to do it for free and not I think
that's how it should be. I think they shouldn't get. It'd be nice to see him not get paid at all, to see him not be able to take out handouts in some way from donors that would benefit them or their family. But I think in the end, there's the desire to be in power and to control other people. That's part of our sinful nature. And you're always going to get people, even just for that alone, that, may not need the finances, but still want to control other people. It definitely helped to reduce the money there. And obviously, if you decentralize power, there's less there. I think I use the analogy. If you have a bank or, the train robbers back in the day, they go after the trains that were transporting huge amount of money. If you have all that power and money in taxation in DC, you're going to attract all the people who want that power and money to use it for their own gain. It's a complete, you're going to draw the worst of society that you want to rule in a democracy.
There's a great blueprint.
Yeah. So you get what you ask for. So if that's what we're asking for, I'd say.
Let's contrast that with the kings of old, because obviously you picture the big, beautiful capes and the crowns and all that. Mm-hmm. Was that the real case back in those days, where they walked? It's like Emperor Charles. Obviously wasn't. It was in the 20th century, but he at least still was going around in a cart handing out bread to the poor people. Versus nowadays, it's very rare to see a monarch or a ruler in any realm do that now. But back in those days, would that be more of a typical thing? And were they dressed to impress, in a sense? Were they flaunting it for the people back in those days?
Right, and from the little bit that I've read on it, they were distinguished from. They had their symbolic dress to show that they were a king, but it was not the dressed in pomp and all that. That I think again started in the the 14th century, and when they started to view themselves as separate and above, and so they started to dress as royalty and really decorate themselves and be above and part. And, they started to be up on the stand, up on the crown, or up on their chair on the throne above everyone else. Everyone was kind of put below, whereas before it was kind of more that even level. And you look at some of the Anglo-Saxon halls and the king's just sitting there at the end and all the benches are here. As the centuries go by, he gets elevated and put above, and he also becomes, more decorative and just a visual of, being above the people. I don't think that's necessarily bad, because I think there's certain benefits to royalty and to hierarchy and looking towards leaders in a certain way, as long as they're reflecting kind of the divine authority that they're supposed to reflect and give back, not in a way that, oh, this is a special human above everyone else.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't trying to mean like he's wearing a starter jacket and rags or anything like that. Just versus like kind of like a mindset type deal. So I'm better than you versus
Right,
I'm here
yeah.
to help you in a sense.
I'm your ruler. You're one of my subjects because you were born in this geographical area, and I think that it's going to inflate the monarch's mind, which absolutely happened. They became far more bold and did things they couldn't, because now they have this new mindset of what a king is. And they have new powers and ability. Of course, they're going to start thinking of themselves as greater and greater. I mean, I was watching a documentary on Hitler on that, and how he really had that as he was rising to power. His head became inflated, and he thought he was more and more special. I think it's innate, and when you increase someone's power and importance, their pride's going to get the better of them. And I think that's what happened to many people. There's always exceptions, though. But to many of the later monarchs, it's kind of hard when you're not in that position.
They go
I
back.
think like I'm a basketball fan, and you go back to the 1950s and 60s, and the great basketball players wouldn't be expected to be treated the way they are today, because we've elevated basketball, that they're these superstars, they're famous. They ask LeBron James what he thinks about different issues. Like, who cares? They wouldn't ask that back in the 50s. It's like, oh, you play basketball, and they'd talk to you probably as a normal person. But because we've elevated its power and the money in our culture, now they think of themselves in a way as, more important than an NBA player in the 50s or 60s.
Oh, yeah, all the sport. I remember Barry Bonds going up to Willie Mays and asked him, "What do you do in the offseason?" He goes, "What I do? I worked." Bonds had millions of dollars, making the minimum wage, and you hear about DiMaggio getting another job, and everyone else they went to work afterwards. You didn't like, I got a paycheck. I'm good for the rest of the time. What was I going before that? You brought up the Germany thing. I was thinking of bring up Thomas Woods again when he mentions if they would not been centralized, then Adolf would have just been a nice postmaster.
Yeah, no, and I think I mentioned that similar in monarchy. Like there was, of course, tyrants in the Middle Ages, but they didn't have the power, and because it was so decentralized and they had competition, you couldn't just take someone out. And Hitler, because Germany's centralized, he has all that power, and now a president is such a dangerous position because he has so much power to cause destruction, far more than any king in the Middle Ages had.
Yeah, don't get me started on that one. So because I wanted to bring in solutions, I guess, in a sense. I look at it going, we got to get decent people at every levels and work. Because again, the whole thing about bringing up Dixie was, how do you get that? You had the carpetbaggers come in to kind of like how they did with Panama. They go in and kill some Panamanians, force their own people in there to get the right vote so they can secede from Colombia. And all of a sudden, hey, we got Panama. Look how easy that was.
Yeah.
So if you get our type of people in, maybe down the road we can help with the mindset of, hey, I'm not doing this for my better, but I'm trying to do this for the people. Maybe not make it about ourselves and flip this thing on its head. You could, in decentralized areas, in a sense, work to fix some of this. It won't be perfect, but it's better than what we got going on.
I think your analogy is correct. The way that would have to work is to get everyone to somewhat centralize in a small county or a small state where they can actually do something and start pushing back towards federal. Because if someone does it in one area, the rest of the country is going to see and be like, ooh, you know what, maybe that's a good idea. That's why I love California. I hope they break off, form their own republic. That'd be amazing. And I don't know Trump might be the one to actually let him go. He'd be like, yeah, sure. I don't know. Any move towards some form of secession or decentralization, I think it would take getting the right-minded people and doing it in a local small section. I know there's some counties in Illinois that want to, they say they're controlled by Chicago, that there's a movement, I think, to join Indiana or Ohio or a more conservative area. Something like that could ignite in people's mind the idea of, why are we all fighting to be forced under one situation? Why don't we kind of live and let live? And I think the younger generation is more almost radical in politics, as it becomes more and more people's religion, really. And they despise the other side. And I think that's going to break nationalism, actually. And they're going to be more willing to, they're more loyal to their party than they are to United States of America, which they don't care as much about. So they'd be more willing to break off or form some more of a decentralized union back to the way it was. But the states are so large now. The colonies were in many ways a united whole. You had the Puritans in New England, the Anglicans in Virginia, and they thought alike. And so that's why it could work. But today the states are so diverse that I really think you need to go to the county level and start having more power in the county and the town level to respond to even state rule as well as federal.
You ever read Bill Kaufman?
Mm-mm.
He's got a Bye Miss American Empire. He's in New York. And he's always talking about breaking away from New York City. You got to get these decentralized the states. And he's a big up French port politics in a sense. He goes, brings up what you used to be in the front porch, see your neighbor, talk to people.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, homes got built so that the backyard is now. So you ignore your neighbor and you just kind of be like on your own type of deal.
Yeah, we're isolated for sure. There's a I think it's Saint Benedict movement, and people are kind of doing that culturally. And a lot of conservative Catholics are moving to the same little villages and living together and creating those communities kind of as the Amish do. And I think that would also affect the politics. But the more people go do that, I think the more they'll want it, and the more they'll want autonomy from outside forces, kind of as the Amish have to some extent. And all that would be great. I love those sort of movements of like-minded people coming together, forming a community. A lot of them are homeschooling, and it's like Trump will tolerate it, but you get a Democrat or a more authoritarian back in there. I'm not sure, because there's really pockets of resistance, and it's like, is the government going to tolerate that, and how do you act to it? But if you get enough people doing it, perhaps.
E. Michael Jones has that in his Destruction of Cities, how the governments were forcing other groups into like the Polish areas or German, and break those communities apart in a sense. You brought up anger, which is great that you did, because you mentioned the centralization mindset causes this anger, because every 2 to 4 years you're having a literal civil war, two factions fighting for control over one government, and it's one side's going, all my stuff I want is going to be taken away from these guys. We got to control this to force these guys, and it's literally anger at each other.
Right. Yeah, and that's part of it. They play upon it because they want those groups at war with each other, so they can be the one to step in and calm everything down or save them. They need us to be at war. If we're a united whole, that's not beneficial to politicians to then manipulate us. So they have to create all this antagonism as well. And politics is a great way to do it and set us against each other.
Again, the book is Missing Monarchy. You get on Amazon. Obviously, the link will be underneath in the show notes. As you see on the screen, it even has audiobook up for 0.00. So buy the book, listen to the book, send it to friends, all this. Again, part 2 will be more. I enjoyed this immensely, but I can't wait for part 2. Anything else you can tell the people about the book, and again, just what they could use, what kind of info what can they do with the information in it?
Yeah, well, I mean, it covers. We covered a lot of subjects. It focuses on politics. I don't offer a whole lot in the way of solution, but I think the more people that read this book and gain this information are going to come up with their ideas or start their. I heard there's a group on Reddit that already started after my form of kingship, and they're looking to educate people and turn it into a political thing. I'm working with a group that's working with Aborigine tribes to try to reinstate their form of kingship and monarchy that they had before the French and English colonized them. So it's definitely getting people moving and thinking different. And one thing I'd like to say is LinkedIn, I've recently began on, and that has all my podcasts. I'm always publishing articles on the Civil War, on Tolkien, on the Middle Ages, and so all my new content is released there if you want to keep up with that.
Very good. No, I like the planting seeds thing. Hard to kill ideas when you got a seed growing in there. It's one thing you can't get rid of. It's putting this stuff in their minds and maybe getting people to think about something they're not getting from. You're not going to hear it from Fox or CNN or what.
Right.
You're talking head, and
Yeah.
most people online, you're definitely not going to. You're going to hear them say, "Oh, we want monarch, we want a king," but they don't even know what they're. Most of them don't know what they're even talking about.
Yeah, it's usually, that's one thing I've found is I've tried to reach out to different monarchist groups, and they're usually advocating for a form of somewhat like England, to add a kind of visual head of a monarch and, the benefits of that, but not really a transferring of the whole system, scrapping, parliament and things like that. In their mind, voting and representatives is how you're represented. They don't realize that that's just a form of stealing their ability to live as they want. So.
Yeah, most I've seen, they want the exact same thing we have right now, except the title of the guy would be the king. And like, wait a minute, it's not working the way it is.
They kind of just want to add another branch that's powerless, that maybe for diplomacy or to try to unite people or to talk about on TV. I don't know.
I'll put all the links in the show notes. I know you're on X, Twitter, whatever we call it these days. I'll try to find out. I'll do the LinkedIn thing as well. Contact him. His email's in the book, so I'm sure you take questions through there.
Yeah, I love any questions or comments. The email is jackson18611096@gmail.com. And anyone who, if you need a free copy, I'd be happy for you to read it that way as well. I could send it in a PDF file, or any questions or comments. That email is a great way to contact me.
Sounds good. All right, we'll have Jeb back on soon. I hope soon.
Looking forward to
it. Take care, bud.
Awesome. Thank you.